Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics. In this episode, I'm going to show you the best thrift shop find ever for me. And you're looking at it. It's a 1980 Atari Asteroids arcade game in the cocktail table variation. This, yes, believe it or not, came from a thrift shop. And the brief story of how I came about it was a cold January evening. It was dark, I was going home, but I knew I didn't really want to go home and watch TV or do something useless like that, but rather maybe I could pick up a piece of electronics that needed some help, and made a short detour and stopped at a local Goodwill store. I looked around, I couldn't find anything. I think the only thing I found was like a wall wart power supply I needed. So I go to the cash register and I'm counting out my 99 cents. And all of a sudden, this guy catches my eyes. Sitting in a dark corner, surrounded by old bicycles. I mean, I could see from a distance that it was some sort of a video game, but I couldn't really tell from where I was standing. So I walk over to it and realized that, well, yeah, it actually said Asteroids on it, but I knew what these looked like, but I just couldn't tell when I first saw it from a distance. I was a little flabbergasted that something like this would show up in a thrift shop, and I knew right then and there I had to have it. Now, it didn't look too much like it looks now. I've spent several rolls of paper towels and window cleaner on this thing and just sprayed it and kept wiping it down until the paper towel would not come back discolored, and it took quite some time. So this thing was, as expected, probably sitting in a bar for a really long time. This top glass was taped down with several miles of clear packing tape. They usually come with corner clips that hold the glass to the top, but the corner clips weren't there. This door, well, actually the door on the other side, this whole panel is a door, was hanging askew. The legs were pretty rusted. You couldn't see much black in there, but it was an asteroid. And so next came the part where I had to go ahead and make sure to buy this. So I walk over to it, and as you can see, the first thing I see is it's tagged at $40. And of course tells me that it is not in working condition, but it is worth a lot if fixed. A challenge if I ever heard one. Now, the good thing was, on top of everything else, I donate a lot to these stores, and whenever you donate a bunch of stuff, they give you a 20% coupon. So my total cost of this out the door was $32. Well, great, you know. I mean, I still had visions of some other electronics enthusiasts jumping in front of me and ripping it away from me and all that, but no, I was like 8 o'clock at night, there weren't too many people there, and there wasn't much risk of anybody else snatching it, especially the way it looked. But we finished the transaction. I gave him my $32, and a kid from the warehouse came and helped me put it in the back of my SUV. And then I drove it home. Just as advertised, I brought it home, did some preliminary checking, and brought it up slowly on a variac. And I guess when I hit the right voltage, I could hear some noises from the monitor, and the 5 volts kicked in on the main board, and there's 2 start game buttons in front which started to flash. There was no image, but when I hit the buttons, I could hear some distorted sound being generated. It was it was Asteroid sound. This is, if I haven't mentioned it, this is one of my favorite arcade games, and I know exactly what they're supposed to sound like. So it sounded like the CPU board was working, but the monitor wasn't. So I opened this up and I checked the connections again, and finally I do the obvious and I turn up the brightness control on the monitor. And I'll be damned, it came up. It was working. It was basically working. I mean, it needed a bit of work to put it back into much better shape. But I had essentially bought a working Asteroids cocktail for $32. So the next thing was, we got to make it look good. Again, I need to emphasize that it didn't, not that it looks great, this glass looks horrible, and we'll have a closer look in a minute. But it was really dirty and filthy, but it cleaned up kind of nicely. So then let's do a more closer inspection of it and see if we can figure out what all needs to be done here. So after the initial cleanup, it became apparent that the worst part was the top glass. I mean, the whole top glass part is a piece of tempered glass with rounded corners, and the graphics of the game printed underneath. Now you can see that a lot of the graphics and stuff has flaked off, and this glass is not really that easy to come by, if at all. But looking at the glass, I think it shows up pretty well in the shot. I mean, it is scratched to hell. I don't know if they drove a bulldozer over this thing or just for grins and giggles said, hey, before we take it to the store, let's use a wire brush on this. But this is scratched badly, and the worst part of it is since it is tempered glass, it has a really hard surface, but once you scratch this, there is no way to get these scratches out. And I tried a lot of stuff. I mean, I tried off, it was glass, I was going to be careful. I tried off with the leftovers of a headlight cleaning kit I had. It didn't make a dent. It didn't make any difference at all. I went and used progressively more extreme ways of doing this. I even tried waxing it and see if the wax would fill in the cracks, and just nothing helped. Fast forward, when I ran out of other options, I actually used an abrasive brass cleaner and very fine sandpaper on it. It didn't make a dent. Nothing. I mean, it didn't even make it any smoother to the touch or so. So I basically knew that this was going to be one of the more difficult things to find and replace. But I will get to the glass a little later, and we'll have a look at some of the other issues I started to take care of. At this point, the game was essentially playable, and the scratches on the glass didn't help much, and the diffuser is also kind of scratched. So, well, the view wasn't that pleasant, but it was playable. Then I noticed that the sound started acting up. Either the sound sounded normal, or it started sounding distorted, or then it would disappear altogether, and it would use a random combination of doing those things. Now, the sound off of this isn't 44.1 CD quality. It's a bunch of 555 timers and a resistor ladder VCA, and it also uses a shift register for the noise. So these are some very basic sounds, and they were distorting pretty badly. And it didn't sound like digital distortion, but rather analog distortion. So what I did was I dug out my sound tracer, which is this guy here. It's basically an amp with two alligator clips on it. And what I did, starting at the CPU board, I monitored the sound, went through the harness and through the audio amps. It's got, I think, two TDA 2002s in there in push-pull operation. Checked the output of those, went through the harness, and ended up at the terminals on the speaker. right there. I pulled the connectors off and connected my audio tracer to the disconnected wires, and everything sounded fine. So obviously it was in the speaker. I did notice some corrosion on the terminals when I tried to put back the connectors. I cleaned that up, but it didn't make a difference. So after playing around with it for a while, I think I found the problem, and the problem was that there's a bunch of thin copper wires going from each of the terminals to the voice coil. Can't see that from here, but they are essentially soldered to the bottom of the terminal over here, and then they snake down and go through the cone and connect to the voice coil. And what I did was I stuck a pair of pliers in, and I yanked on each wire. And when I yanked on the wire, it fixed the problem. So I kind of bent the wire into place and made sure that it was still working. So for now I got a working solution, but it's going to need a new 16 ohm 4-inch 4-watt speaker. And I probably have several of those, except they're not loose. They're in some old abandoned equipment. So I'm going to have to hunt down something that has as close of a form factor and mounting holes as this does, and that should fix the sound problem. I think this is a good time to take a break and get ready for part 2. In part 2, of course, we'll look at a bunch of other problems and see what was done to fix them, or at least to attempt to fix them. Now at this point, if you feel that I hit it big with this thing, make sure to express that with a thumbs up. On the other hand, if you think that I didn't fully exploit my luck, i.e. sat in a car and drove to Vegas immediately, leave me a thumbs up too, and that's because I preferred to bring this home and play with it rather than going to Las Vegas. Nah, it's kind of far, and it was cold and I was tired, and it was a lot more fun playing with this in a warm basement than driving through dark streets. Now make sure that if you're not already subscribed, to subscribe, so you'll know immediately when part 2 becomes available. Won't take long. I have most of the material for that already. See you in part 2.